Today, I'm excited to host two true crime authors who have worked extensively to try and solve a cold case from our state dating all the way back to 1973. Co-authors Brian and Cameron Santana have written a book titled A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. Here's a synopsis. The fascinating story of how two brothers, one an English professor, the other a cop, and as different as night and day, tag team as authors to solve North Carolina's most notorious cold case. A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case by Brian and Cameron Santana is a true crime investigation that unveils the shocking story behind the brutal 1973 murder on campus of 19-year-old Virginia Marie Olson. On April 15, 1973, two high school students discovered Olson's body near the campus of the University of North Carolina, Asheville. The cold case that followed would span over 50 years, involving 3 generations of detectives and the Asheville Police Department and North Carolina SBI as they worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. Olson's murder was horrifically violent. She had been bound, raped, and stabbed to death, leaving the Asheville community in shock. This true crime book takes readers through law enforcement's dramatic efforts to find Olson's killer, facing numerous obstacles along the way, from the abduction of another UNCA student in 1974 to a rape and murder victim's body discovered near Olson's crime scene in 1978. Whispers about the killer's identity have circulated for decades, with theories ranging from an escaped mental health patient to one of North Carolina's most notorious serial killers, until now. A Murder on Campus is the first to tell the gripping story of this unsolved crime and the surprising twist that led to the author's revelation of the killer's identity in North Carolina's most notorious cold case. The book is available now. Brian Santana is a college English professor and writer. After graduating from UNC-Asheville in 2003 with a degree in drama, he earned an MA in English at North Carolina State University and a PhD from the George Washington University. He currently resides in West Virginia with his wife and children. Cameron Santana is a veteran law enforcement officer with over 18 years of experience. He holds an advanced law enforcement certificate and spent his first 16 years with the Raleigh Police Department. He attended Western North Carolina University and currently lives in Raleigh, North Carolina with his wife and children. Welcome, Brian and Cameron, and thank you so much for being here today. Are you ready to get started?
Yeah, thank you for having us. We're glad to be here.
Okay. Brian, I know you first heard about Ginger Olson's murder while you were a student at UNC-Asheville. Can you share more about that story and why you decided to take a closer look into it all these years later?
Yeah, so I was a student at UNC-Asheville, and my first semester was the fall of 1999. The beginning of my college experience really kind of paralleled me learning about Ginger Olson's case for the first time. As you mentioned, I was a drama major, and I was in my very first semester at UNC-Asheville. And at that time, a lot of drama classes were in Carol Belt Theater, for any of the listeners or viewers familiar with Carol Belt. And I was waiting around in the lobby with some other freshmen, but I was new on campus. I didn't have any friends yet. And so I was just trying to make myself appear to be busy. So I was pretending like I was deep in thought, looking at different pictures that were hanging in the Carol Belt lobby. And one of those was a very young woman that was painting a piece of scenery. And an upperclassman came up to me, saw me looking at it, and said, "Hey, I see you're looking at the picture. That's Ginger Olson. You know, she died a long time ago, and it was really sad." And I didn't really think a lot about that at the time. I thought, "Oh, that is sad, right?" Like in the same way it's sad that anybody loses their life, but there was never any sense that she was murdered. Later that semester, another student came up to me and said, "Hey, that's Ginger Olson, and her ghost actually haunts Carol Belt because she died in Carol Belt." And I asked around about that. No one really seemed to know much about it. And before I left UNCA, people said, actually, she did die and her ghost does haunt Carol Belt, but she was actually murdered close to campus. And so for me, a lot of the story made a deep impression early on when I heard it, because I was just like all college freshmen that are starting off. I was kind of imagining what my life was going to look like and what those possibilities were, and to kind of just start my college career and learn about someone else who was very much like me, who was 19, who was a drama student, who had tragically died and didn't have the opportunity to have the rest of her life, made a really deep impression. But the ambiguity about just what happened really kind of stuck with me. And I could never get a very straight story from anyone associated with it. And even some of my professors were people who actually knew Ginger Olson at the time, but they never really talked about it too much. And so it was one of those things that was always in the back of my mind that I was really interested in. Fast forward many years, I'm teaching a writing seminar, and I'd started teaching true crime writing seminars, and my students were always asking me, so Dr. Santana, like, what's a case that you really care about? And this is one that I've been informally researching for many, many years, but just never felt like I could kind of get started with it. And after hearing that question enough times, I decided that this was, I wanted to do it. And the understanding this case was also kind of about understanding the story that played such an important role for me when I was starting my adult life as well.
Yeah. For any listeners that don't know, I also attended UNC-Asheville, and I graduated in 1998, and I somehow did not hear about Ginger Olson while I was there. It wasn't until several years later that I somehow came across the Blue Banner article that had been written. It might have been the one where some students in recent years were researching the story. And I thought it was so weird because I actually took a class with Dee James, who was one of Ginger Olson's, wasn't she her roommate, or she was a very close friend?
She was her proctor, yeah.
Yeah. So I thought it was strange that I hadn't heard about it. But like you said, it just went very quiet for many, many years. And it was around the same time that I started thinking about it too. And it's kind of interesting that you and I were both looking at it at the same time. But let's move on to our next question, which is for Cameron. Working in law enforcement, I'm sure you've always had a strong interest in local true crime. At what point did you decide to join forces with Brian and work on a book proposal about the Olson case?
So that's a really good question. It really kind of spun into something that I really didn't think it was going to turn into. Brian had been contacting me once he started the true crime class, and he'd always throw out these cases and, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Read this article, that sort of thing. And he contacted me one day, and he was telling me of how he really wanted to do something with the Virginia Olson case. And he really pitched it to me as, maybe we can make this into an article. Maybe I can get into the Asheville paper. I really didn't think that this was going to turn into a book until the next day he called me and said, hey, by the way, I submitted this book proposal, and we've got a contract. We've got to pump this thing out in, X amount of time frame. So it wasn't something that I was expecting to get into, but it was something that the more that I read into and started to go down rabbit holes, because there's a lot of twist in this case, it really, it became more fascinating.
And part of me getting started actually with Cameron was he did provide a lot of ends that I didn't have to law enforcement. We had different skill sets together. And when he picks up the phone and calls the head of CID in Asheville or emails them, they would get back to him. And so, and that wasn't just from my own experience researching. That's not always the case when you're kind of outside of that ecosystem. And so once I had Cameron on board, I knew that we would actually be able to dig into this a bit further. And so I was really excited about getting started with it.
Yeah. So today, Asheville is known as, a tourist mecca. It's popular with people that enjoy dining, craft beer, cocktails, and, there's the Biltmore Estate. How was the community different back in 1973? Can you paint a picture of it and the campus of what UNC-Asheville looked like back then?
Sure. I think that the best way for your listeners and viewers to think about Asheville, if they've been to Asheville today, it didn't really look like that in 1973. So the population was about half of what it is today. Today, it's close to around 100,000 people. And in 73, it's about 50 to 53,000 people that live there. Asheville was in a point of transition in 1973 when this murder occurred. It was kind of moving away from a kind of industrial kind of manufacturing center, which it had in the past, and more towards that kind of service industry, kind of culture, tourism centered economy that a lot of people associate with Asheville today. there was a kind of burgeoning art scene that has always been a part of Asheville, going back to the turn of the century, but was really kind of starting to take off in the 1970s. And that's one of the things that actually brought Ginger Olson to Asheville herself. It was becoming a hub for people that were kind of artists and free thinkers, but it wasn't the kind of very progressive environment in the same kind of way we think about today, I think, with Asheville. But there's also in it, so Asheville, like North Carolina, was in a state of transition. Governor Holshouser had been elected governor at this time. So he's like the first Republican governor since Reconstruction. So there's that kind of change. On UNCA's campus, there's only around 800 students at the time. Most of those students were commuters. There was no formal police force at UNCA in 1973. There was a security team, but in terms of kind of sworn-in law enforcement that can make legal arrests, UNCA was actually the last school in the UNC school system to have a police force, so there was no full-time police force. There's Watergate, civil rights, take your anti-war kind of protests that are taking place on campus. The moment Ginger Olson is killed, the poet Nikki Giovanni was on campus, and there's Black arts rallies that are happening. And there's also a lot of students who are kind of coming back to school in the GI Bill. So there's a larger presence of veterans than what had ever existed at UNCA before. So there's lots of things that are kind of in flux and change, I think, both in terms of the nation, North Carolina, and then also Asheville, the community. And I think all of those things kind of intersected to make this a really complicated case.
Yeah. Her murder occurred more than 50 years ago. Excuse me. How did this provide challenges for you when you were digging into the research and looking to find sources?
One of the things I found was really interesting is when Brian and I started digging into the articles, one of the newspaper articles had mentioned that a search was performed, and we assumed that a search warrant had been executed because they listed the items that were taken from the apartment. And so I told Brian, I said, this is an inventory list, and so let's get a copy of this warrant. And normally you should be able to contact the clerk of court in the county where the crime is committed, and you can get a copy of the search warrant. And most of the time, those are not redacted since it's a public record. Sometimes they do if the case is ongoing temporarily. But, that should be a very easy task. I called the clerk of court's office in Buncombe County, and we got a runaround for a good 3 or 4 months where I was calling almost daily trying to find this thing. And, they kept on, it went from, check the state archives, we checked with them, and then they told us AOC had it, and AOC said they didn't have it. I even called a friend that's a lawyer to get involved to see if he could get his contacts to help me find this document. Finally, the city of Asheville was able to provide it for us, but we ran into the same type of difficulties with getting that as well as the ME's report. So you've got those logistical challenges that normally shouldn't be there. And then you've also got the challenge of, because this case is so old, we've got witnesses that are passing away. They've moved to other states, so locating them was difficult. And also, we were contacted even a couple of weeks ago where one of Virginia's boyfriends was experiencing health difficulties. There's a multitude of issues on top of the fact that this is a cold case.
Right.
And Cameron mentioned the issues with the search warrant. I would just point out that kind of issue that he described was like that at every stage. And for listeners and viewers who aren't familiar, a lot of times, like Cameron was saying, the public records dimension of a kind of true crime investigation is typically, that's the kind of easy stuff. When I teach research to my students, they file those requests, and usually within a few weeks, they have all of the actual publicly available records that are there. And I was really shocked that we didn't necessarily have that. So there was a lot of unique obstacles. When I filed for the medical examiner's report, for instance, they mentioned that there was a fire at the medical examiner's office in 1975. that destroyed all of the original medical examiner's records for crimes that occurred before 1975. The charred remains of those files had been transported to North Carolina archives in uncategorized or sorted boxes that were sitting in some dusty warehouse. And the only copies of the ME's report that existed were with the Asheville Police and the North Carolina SBI. But those were a part of the master case file. So those technically weren't available to us. So we ended up having to get in contact with the Division of Health and Human Services for North Carolina, which oversees the medical examiner's office, ask their assistants, get them on board, get them to get a copy from the master case file, because they didn't have a copy from their own offices. And then once they had a copy of it, we could file a request with them and get it. So we were able to get a copy of the medical examiner's report, but pretty much for every single document, and I've got a litany of these that we could kind of talk about if you were interested, but for pretty much all of these documents, there was at least something that was difficult. And public records are really just the starting place. Author Mark Pinsky, who was kind of a kind of godfather, like with this project, and was a very kind of good mentor early on, he likes to describe public records as the kind of bones of a true crime investigation, because there's so many moving parts with people's memories and other kinds of variables. But the public records, rightly or wrongly, are the one thing that are fixed that won't change. We're just trying to retrieve them. And that was kind of where we started.
So before we talk about some of the suspects in the case, for anyone that's not familiar with the case, can you take us back to the day that Ginger was murdered and what was discovered on that day? What was she doing?
Sure. Want to walk her through that?
You want to walk through your timeline, Cameron, or would you like me to? It's up to you.
Good, Brian.
Okay, so the murder took place on April 15th, 1973. This was shortly after the spring break at UNCA. Virginia Olsen had spent her spring break with I'm not going to name her boyfriend here. We do name him in the book and discuss him extensively. And so he was very cooperative and enthusiastic about this project, but she had spent spring break with her boyfriend. He had put her on a bus and he was heading towards Alabama to visit his parents. And when she arrived back on campus, she discovered that day, this was Friday the 13th, and she discovered that her parents were actually en route to Missouri. They were taking an Easter trip to Missouri, and they had called to tell her that they wanted to stop by campus to see her. She lived in Craig Dormitory at UNCA's campus. And so she remarked to her friend Jane Nicholson that Friday the 13th is a kind of lucky day for me, is what was said. And so she was excited to see her parents. And that Sunday, she was kind of worried about some exams that she had coming up, particularly a Spanish exam. So she decided to go down to an area adjacent to the botanical gardens where she had, which were close to campus, which she often liked to do. She liked kind of being outdoors, and she talked with some friends before she left. She walked towards the botanical gardens. This is around 12:45 p.m. And by 1 o'clock, we know that she is in the botanical gardens. By 1:15, a witness spots her conversing with a man at the top of a kind of like a rock formation in an area adjacent to the botanical gardens. And at 1:45, he passes back through. She's not there. He sees a kind of something flapping, which we now know was some of her books. And two high school boys come across her body at 3:30 p.m. They were students at the South French Broad School. They had been with three other classmates, kind of having a weenie roast. And they came across her body, and she had been bound and gagged, and there was a lot of blood. The medical examiner estimated about 3.5 liters of blood that had been lost in a very short amount of time. And they kind of ran and called the police, and that's when the investigation started. The police are on scene within about 10 to 15 minutes. The medical examiner is there around 4 o'clock, and by 8 o'clock that same night, less than 5 hours later, her autopsy has started.
So there were multiple suspects in this case, as you kind of mentioned some of them who I'm sure were interrogated, but you also talk in the book about one that is probably the primary suspect in the case. Can you offer any details about who the police looked at immediately following the murder?
Well, immediately following the murder, there was a few. I'll let Cameron speak a little bit about the main suspect, but immediately following the murder, one of the misconceptions I think people have when they hear the term cold case is imagining cold case does not mean clueless. There was a lot of big investigative work early on. The police actually apprehended a 19-year-old kid about 48 hours after Olson's murder. We talk about this extensively in the book, if for those that are interested. But in the book, we give a lot more details, but they do pick up an individual who had broken into the Greek Center, which was an area near campus. He had what appeared to be blood on his shoes. They polygraph him. The SBI does extensive polygraphs with him. That's one individual that was picked up. There was another serial rapist who lived close to campus for a number of years and was a former UNCA student. That individual had moved to Florida, where he was ultimately convicted of 40 rapes, and that became someone that the SBI was incredibly interested in. There's a number of people who kind of pop up in this investigation. All these people we name in the actual book, and many of these people are ones that the public nowadays is not necessarily familiar with. And Cameron can speak a little bit about someone else who kind of popped up early on as well, one of these main suspects.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is really interesting is that when you're reading these newspaper articles, they do not name the person that the police are looking at for decades, essentially.
Right.
We did name him. We've put the unredacted copy of the search warrant in our book. But what's really interesting is that when I was reading those articles, I thought that this was just going to be one person. And I was really wondering of what the search warrant was based on. And when you read through it, the FBI agent, Charles Chambers, is the one that wrote the warrant. But there was actually two people that day that were together. We'll call them suspect 1 and suspect 2. Suspect 1 is the one that they essentially investigated for decades. But I think that it's important to note that he wasn't alone that day. And so essentially what happened was the two of them arrived at the botanical gardens around 1 o'clock. And they tried to claim, suspect 2 claims that they were at the botanical gardens and that they saw Virginia sitting on the rock and that he pointed the girl out to him.
That's the
And
actual one
once-
was the search warrant.
Yeah, and I thought that was really interesting because Agent Chambers actually noted that there's no way that you can be in the botanical gardens and see where Virginia was sitting. You'd have to actually walk down that path to see her. So, that's a huge inconsistency, I believe. And I really don't see why the two of them weren't looked at. If they were interrogated, that's not been made public. But that was kind of the basis. I don't know if suspect 2 really put the blame on suspect 1, but suspect 1 was also the one that shortly after this went to a neighbor's house, Judy Needles, who just passed away, actually, and knocked on her door and said it was a bloody mess. And we know that suspect 1 had a history of mental illness as well. But when you go down the rabbit hole with suspect 1, there's some other interesting things. Like, he came from a very prominent family. He's produced a few documentaries that you can find on YouTube if you Google his name. But suspect 2, we'll call him that, he also has a very unique background as well. He's got a church in Black Mountain that believes that you can get power from light. It's called the Light Center. And he was also on Ronald Reagan's prayer team. So these are one of the questions that we always had was, how did the two of them, come together like that? Because they seem pretty random.
And if you look at, and I think one of the points Cameron's making is one of the fascinating things I think that your readers and viewers will find about this case is the names that we mentioned in the book, just put them into a simple Google search. Their names have never been used publicly before, and you do not have to dig very deep to find some very kind of strange stuff. And so one of the things that becomes really apparent, even in terms of both the witnesses who were supporting the police affidavit and the potential kind of suspects, there was all kinds of stuff that we could not believe. And it started to kind of reinforce this idea of what made this case kind of so complicated. whether it was tied to potential, credibility issues with some of the people that were involved, or kind of other elements. But it's a very, very strange story. And again, I know we don't have time to kind of talk about all those like strange elements today, but you don't have to look too far. I can tell you that there's psychics, there's serial killers, there is consultants for horror films. There's all these people that's not the story I heard when I was in college. That's definitely not the story that was being reported, but it's one that's there in the documents surrounding the case.
Yeah, and one of the things to point out about the whole serial killer thing, when I was looking at this case, I'm sure that you probably found this, Renee, when you were researching the case, is that you see the Sue Ellen Evans case that is very similar to this case. Sue Ellen Evans was a student at UNC-Chapel Hill. She was also murdered in the Arboretum at UNC-Chapel Hill. They both occurred during the daytime. The suspect in that case tried to rape her and then stabbed her in the heart and then slit her throat, which is what ultimately happened to Virginia. So a lot of people make those similarities. And one of the things I was looking at is randomly like, hey, I wonder if this was the same person that did that. And I came across a North Carolina serial killer that's on death row right now. And it just so happens that he was 16 at the time of Virginia's murder. We know that he was in the area. And the 3 people that he's murdered all 3 by stabbing them in the heart after he rapes them and slitting their throat. And so not only do we have suspect 1 and suspect 2, which place themselves within the 30 to 45 minute time frame that this murder occurred, but we just so happen to have a serial killer that we know for a fact was in the area. He had already started to commit petty crimes. When you look into his background, we know that he was stealing cars and women's purses. He had dropped out of school. And again, I mean, we know that the way that he rapes and kills women is completely consistent with what happened with Virginia. And then there's some other random suspects that have been mentioned throughout history as well. So it's very unique.
That was actually one of the things that we tried to do with the book as well, was because, so there's been all these kinds of theories and rumors and gossip out there. So the way our book is really organized is that we take all of the records, many of which no one has actually seen before. They've never been publicly available, or at least republished in the press. And we kind of reconstruct everything that we know about this investigation from 1973 until 1984. And so there is the SBI really revamps up their investigation in 74. There's a task force that's organized in 77 that explores connections between Olson's case and other North Carolina unsolved murders. And between 81 and 84, that's the last really significant push to solve this case. And so we kind of we trace you through that in a lot of detail, what happened with that investigation. And we try to explain kind of what happened when that suspect that is around in the search warrant that Cameron mentioned, that's executed 2 weeks afterwards, he's living in Santa Fe, New Mexico by the time we get to the 1980s. And the Asheville police go out to Santa Fe in one last push to try to get a confession and potentially make an arrest. And we actually work with the Santa Fe Police Department on this, and they were incredibly useful in trying to help us kind of reconstruct kind of what that was about. So we kind of take you through what is known about this case, and then we explore some of the different theories that have popped up, and eventually offer our takes on those different kinds of theories that have been floating around in some cases for more than 30 years, and kind of offer, based on everything that we know, including some new revelations and evidence that the Asheville Police Department is not aware of in this case, what we think is a fairly reasonable and likely scenario of what happened with this entire thing. But yeah, I mean, one of the things I think investigators struggled with early on was, as Cameron was mentioning, was creating a kind of a narrative. A lot of times investigators want to put something together that seems really it doesn't make any sense. This person is dead that shouldn't be dead. Like, what are the circumstances surrounding her and the people around her? Like, what happened? And there's a lot of different random coincidences, a lot of strange people that make doing so really difficult. We talk about, for instance, on the 1-year anniversary of Olson's murder. In the book, we have an entire chapter talking about this very strange saga where a UNCA student is abducted from campus, and it scares the hell out of the campus community and sets the police originally think that there's a potential connection to Olson. The Asheville Citizen-Times runs a paper, front page of a paper where they have Olson's picture and the picture of the student and says, "A frightening coincidence?" ? And there people were struggling to find that connection. And similarly, we talk about another murder that happens in exactly the same spot that Olson's did. That's also a rape and murder as well. And so there's a lot of these moments where investigators are really trying to kind of make sense of all of this.
And it's so funny because, for so many years, I feel like everybody was fixated on the Highland Hospital connection, which Highland Hospital was a mental health facility that was just down the hill from campus at that time. Yeah. And I think that the community believed somebody from there was responsible because there were a lot of people that had day passes, or during the day they could come and go as they pleased in between their treatment sessions. And then it sounds like you guys have uncovered way more than those initial theories. And I do have the question, was the main suspect, was he a patient there?
He was receiving psychiatric care, but he was not a patient at Highland Hospital.
Okay. So that clears up a lot of the rumors that were going around for so many years.
And I should say
that's actually, sorry to cut you off. I think that's actually pretty interesting. And we mentioned this when we were trying to figure out how that rumor started. I got in contact with a guy that actually, I found him because I was trying to find out where you got your research, I'll be honest with you. And
me?
Yeah.
That's funny.
And I found the social media site that you
Reddit?
reached out to some people.
Yeah. Oh, okay. On Facebook?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I just started messaging all those people.
Yeah.
And one of the guys got back to me, and it was kind of funny because I won't mention his name, but I just asked him the simple question, like, how did you hear about her murder, or did you work at the hospital? Just basic questions like that. And he went on this long rant about how there's like evil spirits at the hospital and that the person escaped and murdered Virginia and then came back with bloody clothes, and the doctors at the hospital knew about it, but they were and it turned into this big conspiracy. And then it turned into like 5 pages of, everything from how the evil spirits are taking over the world. And this is like when Hitler was, and throwing in Satan in there. And I was looking at that and I was reading it to Brian, and I was like, this is so laughable. We've got to be able to work this in there. But then I was reading through that, and he actually was correct about some of the aspects, like that the guy was from a prominent family. Mm-hmm. I think that there was some truth to some of the rumors, and especially that he may have not been at the hospital, but he definitely is schizophrenic or has some type of mental health disorder, because he goes to a mental health facility in New Mexico, which is where he ends up passing away at. And there's from what we can tell, a long history of mental health issues. So it is kind of interesting how you've got these wild rumors that occur, but there is some truth to them.
Right. And there were people that said they were orderlies at the hospital that saw him come in after the murder. It's weird how it just kind of spiraled with these eyewitness accounts that really couldn't have been true. But there was a little piece of truth in every one of them. Like, if you really think about it.
And that's some of the questions I asked too, was like, okay, did you actually see this occur? Like, did you actually see him walk into the hospital with bloody clothes? Like, who actually saw that happen? And it was always, oh, well, I didn't see it, but this other guy that I know, he saw it. And then you would chase that down, and it just kept on getting further and further pushed out. One of the claims was that there's a off-duty Asheville police officer that worked there, and that was like the source of information.
Yes.
And you see that, and you're like, okay, maybe the cop was relaying some information about the case, especially that this person has a history of, mental health disorders and whatnot. But I think that was kind of spun into that this was a person that was at the hospital, and I'm sure they were looking for bloody clothes. I mean, because like Brian was saying earlier, she got stabbed in the heart. It produced a lot of blood. So,
a very small wound.
It's very interesting how things develop.
And, speaking to that as well, though, there was also the very first suspect, that 19-year-old kid picked up, he actually had escaped from a mental hospital in Richmond, Virginia. So it was so there are a lot of people that have ties to different mental hospitals. And so I think, at least my best guess is that because there's so many people with mental health issues that pop up in this story, that some of these just get collapsed into one around around Highland Hospital. But yeah, the very first kid they picked up was that they polygraphed at the SBI was had escaped from a mental hospital in Richmond.
Well, it's like that game of telephone where someone says one thing, and then by the next time that it gets relayed, it changes a little bit, and then it changes a little bit, and it changes a little bit. I think one of the most interesting things about everything that you guys have uncovered is that there is this underlying level of mysticism there, that it's Asheville. I didn't know that was part of this story, but it makes complete sense that it ended up being part of the story. And my main question is, well, I've always thought it was odd that it was broad daylight. Someone was murdered in broad daylight, and there happened to be all these people around, and yet they couldn't figure out who the murderer was. But it also was a very isolated area of the gardens, so it makes sense. But what do you think were some of the major roadblocks that investigators ran into right away when they started investigating?
So there's a lot of things. Why don't you?
So one of the things. Okay. I think there's a few things going on that if we look at this through the lens of what would we have done differently today that they didn't do in 1973, you've got to remember that in 73, training and standards for police officers had just started. So there was not a uniform training on how to handle a crime scene. And so you see those kind of mismanagement of the crime scene happen right away. One of the first things you do at a murder is after you render aid to the victims and make sure the scene is safe, is you lock down the crime scene. So you'd lock down that entire area. So if that happened today, all the surrounding woods would have crime scene tape, and we try to preserve that area as best as we can. So no one's walking in and out. No one's messing with the body. We're going to try to make that as pristine as possible. When we're looking at what happened in 73, we can clearly see that people are able to walk in and out through that area. In fact, her roommate even walked into the crime scene to show a picture to the police officer to see if that was Virginia or not. There's also photos of the body being carried out, and the officers don't have porcelain gloves on. We know that the bindings that were used, for those that don't know, her shirt was cut up, and that's what was used to tie her arms and her legs. We know that was removed at the scene, which is one of the things that when we're talking with the medical examiner investigators and some crime scene agents, that's one of the first things that they said, those bindings would have copious amounts of DNA on them and would be, really critical to the investigation. All that stuff was kind of messed up. We also know that her body was only on scene or she was at the morgue in 4 hours, which that may seem like a lot of time, but it's really not. Like, that's pretty rough. Before her body would be moved nowadays, like, they would make sure that every piece of evidence is collected that they can. So there'd be a lot of care taken with that type of thing. You have those things happen, and then you've got officers which, they're doing the best that they can, but there's really not a lot of experience with those officers who are on the scene. That's one of the funny things that we mentioned in our book is I put about how it was the first weekend I was working and we had a double homicide and I was like right around the corner when it happened. So myself and my training officer were the first one on scene. And so that's one of the things that I brought in was just trying to let people know what that feeling's like. And I really think that when you've got these guys who've never experienced a murder and they show up in at 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon and there's a college student that's got a hole in her heart and there's blood all over the place, like, that's got to be really unnerving and something that you don't really handle well unless you've done that before and you've got people that can kind of walk you through what to do. And that didn't happen at 73. So,
and it was a small town. It was a really small town at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And nowadays with small towns too, if they have a murder, the SBI comes in right away and normally takes over. And the SBI helped in this case as well. And when we're looking at some of the people that worked on it, like Charles Chambers, for example, he's involved in a lot of really crazy murders throughout that region. So he's got experience, but, those guys aren't going to respond that day. The first ones on scene are those initial officers, and that's really that critical time. So I think that that's just a huge challenge, not to mention just the other things of, you've got people that it's a crowded day. It's a nice day. So we know that people are, grilling out or having a weenie roast and hiking around. And the actual botanical gardens is so crowded with people that Virginia chose to, choose that spot on the rock. So, I mean, just logistically getting witnesses with a few officers that don't have a lot of experience. The crime scene is a mess. That's a lot of factors to deal with.
And also in terms of once her body is collected, the medical examiner's office, we had some people from the North Carolina medical examiners that are affiliated with them that offered us some thoughts about this case. And I had also consulted with a medical examiner in Pennsylvania surrounding Olson's autopsy. And one of the things they remarked, because they had just worked on more actually working on autopsies, but not necessarily the historical records surrounding autopsies. And I remember she looked at the autopsy from Olson's and said, well, this is like a very rudimentary, it's mostly a physical exam of what they're kind of describing. There's not really a lot that they've collected. They tested her blood alcohol level. They observed and collected semen that they looked at under slides, and they found that the semen was very fresh. The sperm were still motile. There's no rigor mortis that had set in, but they described it as a very kind of a rudimentary exam. So rape kits had been developed around the time of Olson's murder, but they weren't really being used. And because DNA is, we're a long ways away from that, just the way the medical examiners collected evidence and also stored evidence is a little differently. So today, a sperm sample taken from a kind of rape and murder that's done today, then they're going to really want to hold on to that, even if they're not getting a good kind of a DNA profile initially, because there could be tests that kind of come about in the future where that could be potentially valuable evidence. And a lot of those things weren't really on their radar in the 70s. The best they could do in the 70s, they could do what we describe in the book as like a secretor test, which there's a certain percentage of the population that secretes red blood cells in other kinds of bodily fluids like semen or sweat. And you can tell someone's blood type from like their semen, for instance. That was a test they could do in 1973. But that and fingerprints, that's like in the early 70s. That's like what really advanced forensics look like. And so since that's what advanced forensics look like, that they wouldn't have both stored or seen the value in preserving certain pieces of evidence in a way that would make them conducive for the kinds of work we do now. And that also is a challenge that couldn't have been anticipated in the 70s, but becomes one that is very problematic today when investigating.
Yeah. And I know people, when they probably first hear about this case, they think, well, there was semen, there was blood, all this other stuff. But they have to realize that the collection methods were different. They were limited in what they could test for. Evidence processing wasn't exactly the same. And then, as Cameron was saying, you have a small town, you have possibly police officers who are not as experienced investigating homicides. And it's just kind of the perfect storm for not being able to solve the murder as quickly or at all as people wanted it to be solved. But in your book, you do name who you think is the perpetrator, correct?
Well, we named the individual who police thought was for 13 years, including Will Anarino in the 1980s, who is the head of detectives at that point. He is the one who really reopens the case in 1981 for this last big push. Now he told the Citizen Times that he had absolutely no doubt in his mind who was responsible. In fact, I'm paraphrasing here. He says, I know where he lives. I know where he works. And it bothers me that every single day he gets up and goes along with his life, and we need to find him a way to hold him accountable. So that individual that's sometimes passively referred to in the papers, we tell you about him in the book. So you'll know who he is. And it is quite an interesting story. Yeah, we also talk about kind of the investigator's logic. We also uncovered some new evidence that's never been discussed before that was original to us, that we think offers a potential connection, another connection to this suspect, if you want to go down that particular theory.
So this has been such an enduring mystery in Western North Carolina for such a long time, but a lot of people outside of North Carolina were not aware of it. What do you think true crime fans will take away from this book?
I think that there's a lot of things that could be kind of learned from this case. I think if you are a true crime fan and you enjoy the stories where there are lots of unexpected twists, where there are lots of very strange characters, I promise you this is not the story that you have been told, that you have read in the newspapers, or that you have heard gossip about. It is far more interesting and far stranger than that. I tell Cameron all the time, every day there's some kind of new revelation where it's like, I can't even believe that this is part of the story. And so I think for fans of the genre, and particularly if you like one with lots of different potential rabbit holes and twists, like we have that in abundance in this story.
What do you think, Cameron?
Yeah, I think that the amount of rabbit holes that you can go down with this case, I mean, it's really is incredible. But the uniqueness of the suspects involved, this is not the boyfriend is jealous and murders his girlfriend type of book. Right. This is two guys that, well, one of them was looked at for decades. We talked about earlier all the rumors that spun off because of his life. And then he's with a guy that is, unique in himself. And then you throw in there, like we said before, the serial killer that just happens to be in town and just happens to murder women in the same fashion.
Was that Terry Hyatt?
And by the way, for your listeners and readers, if you want to see what happens when you send a message to a serial killer on death row, Cameron talks about the experience of reaching out to Terry Hyatt, and it's an interesting story too.
Oh man, I bet that was a whole chapter in itself.
Yeah, there's a lot of unique things about that, but we also have some aspects in there like the Highland Hospital, which we mentioned earlier. We've got a chapter on that because there's a ton of crazy stuff that happens in that hospital. And we also shared I shared some personal experiences about like my first murder that I went to, and just kind of how laughable that was as far as my response to it, as well as one later on in life where a guy admitted to killing his girlfriend and called 911 on himself, and then tried to kill himself and didn't succeed somehow. Yeah. I mean, the guy literally cut a pie out of his neck. Yes. And all that, so some side stories like that are in there. The other things too that are really unique about this is just, you've got this murder on campus that occurred, and then the next year, you've got a kidnapping, and then you've got a murder that's similar in nature that happens a couple of years later. And all those things are in the book as well as some really interesting characters that were looked at by the SBI during this task force, like the kid that, he raped like 50 women in Florida?
40, I think, but yeah.
Yeah.
And I would also say that...
so there's a lot more to the story than just one murder.
And one of the things that we hear from a lot of Ginger Olson's friends, we interviewed around 32 people who knew her from her time between high school and college. And they are all people who passionately care about getting her story out there. They have all expressed similar concerns that Virginia Olson has somehow been lost in this entire story, that she's become more of a kind of a ghost figure, a kind of cautionary tale. And one of at least a secondary goal of this book was to actually tell Virginia Olson's story, write her in as a full person. So we have a lot of stories from people who knew her. And one of the interesting aspects about our book, speaking about our investigation, is that Virginia Olson was a prolific letter writer. In fact, she kept most of her closest friends still lived in Virginia while she was in college at North Carolina. She had moved right after graduation to Lexington, North Carolina, and was attending UNC-A. But she kept in touch and would go back during visits to visit with her friends in Virginia. And many of her very closest friends have kept all of her letters to this day. She wrote letters during some stretches of the semester on a weekly basis. She constantly carried around journals and was writing.
Wow.
And we quote from some of these letters in the actual book. But some of these individuals who received these letters have never been contacted by the police ever. And they have letters that were sent, in some cases, postmarked the day before her murder. And so we think that these letters not only shed light on developing Virginia Olson as a very full person, but these also reveal some potential evidence that has never been discussed before surrounding this case. This goes to what investigators might describe as the victimology, right? Like who this person was and the people that surrounded them. Well, these letters, we think, offer a really good kind of insight. And so to put this in perspective, one of the people we quote in the book, he talks about the experience of receiving a letter from her. Some of these batches of letters that she sent out on April 14th, 1973, the day before she was murdered, they actually were delivered and arrived after her friends got back from Tennessee and her funeral. And so one of them we quote extensively talking about the very surreal and strange experience of reading Virginia talk about her kind of hopes and dreams and aspirations for the summer and kind of beyond after they had just finished burying her. And so there's a lot of different places like this of just writing her in as an actual person, but also a lot of, we think, potential insights into what might have happened that can be gleaned from those who were closest to her.
I love that you had the opportunity to actually bring her literal voice into the book. That's something, you're right, it's never been done anywhere before. She was just this figure, this tragic figure. And now maybe people can actually get more of a glimpse of who she was and why it was such a tragedy that she was murdered at the time that she was. So that's great. I love hearing that.
And it's a story that UNC-Asheville struggles to narrate to this day. All colleges, I think, struggle to deal with these tragedies. It's a very difficult thing to figure out what to say. But while this book comes out on the 21st, you can pick it up at Barnes & Noble, on Amazon, on Audible, starting January 21st. But as we prepare for this book to come out, UNCA is also in the process of closing their drama department. So it was phased out during the Board of Governors. So we also think this book comes at an interesting time, not only for the people who knew Virginia Olson directly, this is our last opportunity to try to definitively solve this case. I remain, and Cameron and I sometimes have some differences about this. I firmly believe that when you see the name of this prime suspect in the book and those around him, if you are someone who reads them and has any affiliation with them from their time in California or New Mexico or Massachusetts or North Carolina, I do not believe that this is a case where these individuals that we think are likely responsible have went the rest of their entire lives, because they're deceased now, but they went the rest of their entire lives without ever saying anything potentially incriminating to someone else. And so we do hope you will reach out to us if you are someone who has some ties to those, because forensically, this case will not be solved based on the evidence, the physical evidence that they have. But I really do believe this case can be solved based on the people who were close to the perpetrators. I firmly believe this was something that was passed down. We talked to some of the children and grandchildren of some of the original witnesses to this case that were used in the SBI affidavit, and they very distinct. Some of them were just 7 years old when their parent was involved as a witness in this case. They distinctly remember this moment, and this was a kind of traumatic thing that made an impression. I firmly believe that there was someone equally tied to the perpetrator who heard something that maybe didn't make sense before, or maybe just gave them pause. But you read our book and you see their name in there and you connect those dots. I do hope that people will reach out to us, because we think this is the way that this will be solved.
Well, and also along with those lines, I highly doubt that the person that killed Ginger Olson never committed another crime.
And that's what I feel the same way is. I really don't see how the person who did it in that manner, because this does not feel to me like it was a boyfriend and girlfriend who got into an argument and he pulls out his pocket knife and stabs her. This is, we mentioned Terry. I think that when you look at how Terry murders and rapes people, it's, he's like an animal. When you hear him talk about it, he's just like, oh yeah, I wanted to have sex with her. And so that's why I snatched her, up, and I don't want her to talk. So I knew I had to kill her. Like, it's very just no emotion involved. And I completely agree. And that's what kind of puzzles me is when you look at these two guys, did they do something earlier on in life? We know that the first suspect that was investigated, he had like a voyeurism charge in San Francisco. But I do think that that's a pretty big upgrade from going from voyeurism to, the manner in which Virginia was murdered.
And voyeurism, for your listeners, this was basically like a peeping Tom, is like a charge, is what it was.
Right.
Yeah. And speaking,
but yeah, that's one of the puzzling things is you've got all these people that really, could have done it. And it's a very small time frame when we actually put a timeline in our book to help the reader. And the timeline is based on all the reported times from papers, as well as witness statements and the search warrant and the medical examiner's report. So, I feel like it's as accurate as it can be. And I really think that we're looking at max a 45-minute time frame that this happened. And so, yeah, I think that when you look at this, it's a really big question. And I think that that's one of the fun things about this book from a reader's point of view is everyone can have a different opinion, and there's plenty of supporting facts in the book to kind of support your own. You could think that Terry did that. I think there's plenty of evidence to support that circumstantially he may have been involved. This may have been his first murder, and he would have been 16 at the time. But yeah, I really don't think that you can also ignore the fact that these two gentlemen put themselves at the crime scene at around 1 o'clock. And we know that, you're looking at between like 1 and 1:45.
Yeah. Yeah. So Cameron's referring to, we have a witness in the affidavit that at 1:15, we named this witness in the actual book. But this witness spots Virginia talking with a man at 1:15. And by 1:45, he gives an affidavit to the SBI that he passed by the same area and she was no longer there. And he sees some of her stuff left there in a way that was visible. So based on that, we are pretty certain that, Detective Kevin Taylor and some of the current cold case detectives from Asheville, they are very convinced the murder did not take place anywhere else. It was right around the area where she was found. So assuming that is true, then we're really just talking about a period from 1:15 to 1:45 is when this murder occurred. So it's a fairly short time frame. But to speak to Cameron, one of the things that made this very complicated when you had asked earlier about the obstacles, well, this voyeurism charge, for instance, with the main suspect, I had communicated with the San Francisco Police Department, and they could confirm he actually had 2 voyeurism charges on his record, but they also said because of their retention schedule, they had destroyed the original incident reports that were filed. So those reports don't exist. This main suspect that the police had was a Korean War veteran, but the Army's personnel records were destroyed between 1912, for everyone who served between 1912 and 1959 with a last name that was from H to Z. Their records were destroyed in the fire. And so the SBI will tell you they tried on 2 different occasions to get his Army record, and they've never been able to find it either. And so the military had told us that the records were destroyed in that fire. There was also even with the SBI, the retention records, when I was trying to get the personnel records for some of the original investigators. So there's a guy named James Thomas Maxey and a guy named Bill Matthews, who would later become the assistant director of the SBI in the 90s. They're both assigned very early on in 1973 in this case. But when I had filed for their personnel records with the SBI, I was originally told that they didn't have any record of them because of their retention schedule. If it was more than 30 years, they destroyed all of their records for those individuals. So Angie Grube at the SBI was incredibly helpful. She, to her credit, and her staff, they dug up the records we were looking for, and they were able to find them through another route. But I think this is another example that these things weren't just, none of this stuff was like easy. It was a grind with everything that we might take for granted in a normal kind of true crime research.
Well, in an hour-long procedural show, all that would have just majestically appeared, right? Anytime you looked for it.
Oh, and we think that if someone's interested in a documentary for this, there are areas that we allude to and will point you in the direction of, but there's a lot of kind of strangeness that in some cases that could be developed even further. And so we think this is a really bizarre and fascinating story that offers a really good window, not only to this kind of like moment in 1973, this happening, but also just how kind of police investigations have evolved over the years and how some of these cold cases that have been cold for a really long time, there's a lot of these, if you look really closely and press on them, there's a lot of really specific and often strange circumstances that prevented them from being solved because it wasn't for lack of interest. The governor gets involved in this. They escalate the reward. And they even assigned 2 SBI agents for a number of months just working on the Olson case full time, to the point where that was actually controversial because they were understaffed in the Western North Carolina districts, and some of the other agents had publicly grumbled that they thought there were too many resources being put towards the Olson case. So it wasn't for lack of effort that this was not solved.
Okay. Well, you guys are very well versed in true crime in this area that my podcast focuses on. I just would love to talk about any other cold cases in North or South Carolina that you have a specific interest in or that you've researched or would possibly, pick for another book project.
So that's kind of funny. When I was trying to find someone in Asheville that could, like a friend of a friend, I'll be honest, I was trying to get the case file. And so I started calling around, and it seemed like Asheville is kind of in their own little bubble. I ended up just cold calling Kevin Taylor, which I was really hoping for like a, hey, this is a friend of mine type of thing. But I was talking with a friend that is in an agency near the mountains, and he was telling me about Asha Degree, which
Yeah.
I'm sure that you've probably heard about that case. And so there's some really interesting suspects in that case that he's got family members that worked on. So we end up having some conversations about that. But then the other one that we've been looking into is Rhonda Henson. I don't know
Yeah.
if you're familiar with that case.
Yep.
Um,
Yes. And yeah, I don't know if you know, but there has been a reporter that has dug up a lot of information about that and has
yeah,
basically narrowed in on the main suspect. And I've actually tried to reach out to him, but I haven't heard back from him. So, and it was on
yeah,
Unsolved Mysteries back in the
Yeah.
right.
80s, I think,
Yeah.
or
I think that's
90s. I
mine.
remember seeing it on
Yeah.
there.
So that's kind of one of the fun things about getting involved in these projects I've found is that I never knew that some of my friends worked on these cases. Like with the Asha Degree, I didn't realize that one of my coworkers when I was with Raleigh worked on that case. And then a good friend of mine, his father was the one that was with the team that found her book bag. And so there's some things like that that kind of pop up, and we're really looking forward to working with them and, talking with those. I think that these next couple books will be a lot easier. But the other one too that Brian and I were talking about is the Brittany Locklear case. Not sure if you're familiar with that one.
Is that South Carolina or is that North
That's
Carolina?
North Carolina.
Carolina, yeah.
Yeah, I think I did a podcast episode on that.
Yeah, so come to find out, my current chief in Wilson's Mills, North Carolina, was with the SBI, and he actually worked on that case as well.
Was that the
So
Lumberton area? Was that
yes,
East North?
Yes,
Yeah,
this is
okay.
yeah,
the
where
abduction
the
and incest, yeah.
mom steps inside,
Yeah.
to go to the bathroom, and when she comes out, the daughter's gone, and then there's a report of pickup truck that may have abducted her. Yeah, it's a really interesting case, to say the least.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, we've got a bunch of projects. I think doing one on Terry Hyatt would be fun too. He's a really interesting character.
He is. And I know that some of his victims, he just literally abducted off the side of the road. I mean,
That's his MO. And that's
yeah.
what's so crazy. Which
It's
really
scary.
blows my mind. And I don't know if you saw this or not, but he essentially got away with it until the 90s. I mean, and the only reason why, and we talk about this in the book, is the only reason why he was even caught was because his drunk friend walks into the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. Supposedly, he had alcohol on his breath and starts confessing to a captain in investigations about this murder that he witnessed with Terry. And then he tells the investigator, he says, well, I know that this sounds like a bunch of bullshit. Why don't you go talk to my friend? And then he goes and talks with his friend, and his friend starts telling him about this whole other murder. And, it.
Well, didn't he also have didn't someone survive one of his attacks?
Yeah, he had one kidnapping, and that's the one that he went to jail for. And when he was driving her over the French Broad River, he said, I put a lot of bodies in that. I'm paraphrasing, but he said that he had put several bodies in that river and that she was one of the lucky ones. And for some reason, he did not kill her and let her go. And she was promising, not to call the police. And of course, she did as soon as she got home and he was picked up. But, that's another case of, I really wonder what his true body count is. Because we know that when he eventually gets sentenced, they take his DNA, and then he gets popped with the murder in Charlotte based off DNA. That's 3, but when you look at the time frame, it's like, I really don't think people that are that sick stop. I don't think that they have these lulls of going years and years without murdering someone.
No, and I've always kind of felt the same way about Leslie Eugene Warren, that he probably also had other victims. He was also from he was from the Asheville area.
Right.
I feel like he probably had other victims that have just not been identified at this point.
And this question of like where,
it's,
this question of like where they actually started is kind of an open one, right? With Terry, but we know one of his victims is dumped almost 3 miles exactly from the spot where Olson's body's found. So it, he's in the area. When did he begin? They don't really know, since he was caught so far after the fact, and some of these murders were attributed to him. We don't know what that kind of entry point was for him. The same way with this prime suspect in this case, the FBI like estimates about 10% or so of these people who start off with these smaller like voyeurism kind of crimes will escalate to something a little bit more violent. But when was this person a part of that group that escalates? It's hard to say, but we think that there's some really kind of compelling evidence to suggest that this is worth a really close look, particularly with some of the new evidence that we uncover that offers a potential connection between him and Virginia Olson.
Yeah. Well, I have taken enough of your time up today. This was a really great conversation. I'm so excited you guys were able to do this. I look forward to reading the book. I encourage everyone else. I mean, if this didn't wet their whistles, I don't know what else could have. I know that a lot of our listeners are going to be very excited to get their hands on the book. So again, thank you guys for coming. Please keep in touch, and I will do my best to help you get the word out. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
We
Okay.
certainly appreciate it. And I think we mentioned it before. The book can be found at Barnes & Noble, on Amazon, and Audible as well, starting on January 21st by the time everyone hears this podcast. So, and Cameron has our social media as well. He could mention if they do have any kind of...
Yes, please let us know where people can find you.
Yeah. So you can find us on X at Santana Brothers True Crime. Also, Brian has a verified account. It's Brian Santana on X. And then you can also find us on IG at Santana Brothers True Crime.
All right. Well, again, congratulations on the publication of the book. And thank you guys again for being here today.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. We enjoyed it.